Friendly reminder that this event is being recorded. If you can't stay on for the full amount of time, we will be sharing the recording after the event. So again, welcome everyone. I hope you're having a fabulous Friday. My name is Araceli Estrada. I am a program assistant with the Center for Health Equity Transformation, or CHET. We want to thank you all for attending this event today, hosted by CHET and sponsored by Illinois Moms Demand Action and the Northwestern Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. Again, thank you for joining us today for our event titled Deadly Misogyny, the Intersection of Gun and Gender-Based Violence. So before we get started, I know we might have some folks that are new to CHET's programming. So I'll do a quick just recap of our center. Our mission is to lift health for all by exposing root causes of health inequities and serving as a hub that pushes boundaries in research, education, workforce development, and community engagement. At this time, I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Tracy Kurtzer. She is the Medical Director of Trauma-Informed Care and Education in the Department of OB-GYN at Northwestern Medicine. One of her clinical roles in the Center for Sexual Medicine and Menopause is as a trauma expert and is taking care of women who have experienced sexual violence, domestic violence, and medical trauma. She also teaches healthcare workers at Northwestern and other Chicago hospital systems about trauma-informed care and how to engage in their own practices with patients and incorporate these into hospital policies. She is a member of the Chicago Trauma Trafficking Task Force's Health Committee and on the Steering Committee on Gun Violence Prevention for the national group Doctors for America. She has been a member of Moms Demand Action since 2013 and has been more active in community gun violence prevention efforts and organizations since ending her 13-year solo OB-GYN private practice and joining Northwestern in 2015. With that, I want to welcome Dr. Kurtzer and the panelists. So I'll let Dr. Kurtzer take it away.
Great. Yes, and thank you so much for the introduction. And it really, truly is an honor to be moderating this discussion with our amazing panel of activists from Chicago. And I do want to thank the members of the Center for Health Equity Transformation as well for hosting and all the behind the scenes work to make this happen, particularly by Samantha and Araceli. And I also want to reiterate my thanks to Illinois Moms Demand Action and my own department for their support for this program, but also their respective dedication to ending gun violence and also promoting the health and well-being of girls and women across Illinois. So first, I want to make sure that everybody knows that we may get into some depressing statistics and some sensitive topics today. And so at any point you are feeling overwhelmed by the information, if you feel like you need to take a break, please do so. Take care of yourselves. As Araceli mentioned, it is being taped. You can always access the information later, and we will send out a PDF of some of the slides as well with the information. But also please feel free to reach out to me personally. My email is tracy.kurtzer@nm.org. If you do feel like you have any strong emotions or physical responses from this discussion today, and I will be available after the panel event. And this conversation is probably going to be uncomfortable for many of us at times too, because the intersections of gun violence occur with so many other social and racial justice issues. So please listen with an open mind to what our panelists are saying. So many of them have been involved in gun violence epidemic in Chicago and its root causes for many years. And the bottom line is we do have to find solutions, right? We need to figure out different ways to handle this crisis when 100 Americans on average every day are being killed by firearms in this country and twice as many are being injured. And we owe it to the victims of gun violence. We owe it to the families in the communities that are traumatized. And we even really owe it to our own medical colleagues who are also traumatized by these violent acts. And so before we get started, I do want to acknowledge that June is a really tough month for many activists and survivors in the gun violence movement. It's the month where we celebrate National Gun Violence Awareness Day, or Wear Orange. And so for any survivors on the call and webinar today as participants, my heart's with you. Thank you for being here. Also, a few weeks ago, we not celebrated, but mourned the tragedy of the 5-year anniversary of the Pulse nightclub mass shooting. And that happened in Orlando. 49 individuals were murdered that day, and it was a hate crime against the LGBTQ and primarily Latinx community. And last, day-to-day gun violence always picks up in summer. So June is always a tough month. In fact, 54 were shot, 7 fatally last weekend. And again, we lost another 7 more just on Monday alone. And we as a city now dubiously lead the country in the number of mass shootings, averaging about 1 per week. And mass shootings are generally defined as 4 or more individuals that are shot and killed at a single event. So just to reiterate, the majority of firearm homicides actually do not occur in the United States, do not occur as mass shootings at schools or concerts or nightclubs. Most often happen in homes and neighborhoods across the country on a day-to-day basis. And so I always want to center survivors at our talks about gun violence. And today I wanted to remember Marissa Boyd Stingley. She was a 19-year-old who was shot and killed 8 years ago today, along with 3 friends who were all injured by gunfire in the attack, just while they were sitting in a car in the Park Manor neighborhood. And her mother, Nortasha, has been a really important survivor voice in the GBP activism movement. And I told her I would be sure to honor Marissa today at today's event. And she wanted me to share this statement with you all. Suddenly your child is gone, and yet the families have to go on. It's not just the person lost who's harmed, but the parents, the grandparents, and siblings. However, one important thing to know is that the shooters can't take away what we hold on to daily. They can take away the physical body, but they can't take away the memories and the love that we have for our babies. So gun violence is, of course, multifactorial, and today we are focusing on gun violence perpetrated on others and the connections specifically to gender-based violence. So here's a really good place to review some terminology. When I speak today, I'll be using particular terms. Domestic violence refers to violence including threats and acts of physical harm, sexual violence, and emotional abuse perpetrated by a current or former intimate partner, a family member, or someone who shares a dwelling. When I use the term women, I'm including all who identify as women regardless of their gender identity at birth. When I use the term gender-based violence, I'm referring specifically to violence perpetrated against women and gender non-conforming individuals. And misogyny refers basically to hatred for women. So why did I convene this panel? Well, even though men and boys are the primary victims and perpetrators of gun violence, the main impact I see on a daily basis is in my work with women. I see the fear in my patients' eyes telling me about an abusive partner who owns a firearm. I hear the strain in the voices of the women who tell me they didn't feel they could safely leave a situation because the perpetrator of their sexual assault had made sure that they had seen the gun nearby. This violence perpetrated mostly by men is often due to misogyny and the need for dominance and control over others. And this combination is often referred to as toxic masculinity. It's toxicity due to the acceptance of violence towards women or gender non-conforming individuals as a result of a belief of a system of male supremacy. So I'm going to read through these statistics now. Abused women who live in a home with a firearm have a 5 times higher risk of femicide. Over 50% of the women murdered in the United States are killed by a former or current intimate partner, and 50% of those women die by firearm. Black and Indigenous Alaska Native women are at 2 to 3 times higher risk for femicide in the United States, and 77% of incarcerated women, primarily brown and Black, have a history of past abuse. One review of 749 mass shootings showed that 60% were either domestic violence-based attacks or committed by men who had a history of domestic violence. 54% of the mass shootings are related to intimate partner and family violence. And in the United States, about 4.5 million reported being threatened by a firearm, and 1 million women reported being shot at or shot by an intimate partner. Black women are about 1.4 times more likely, and Indigenous Alaska Native about 2 times more likely to die from lethal police force. On average, there are about 28 hate crimes involving a gun daily in the United States, and 1 in 5 hate crimes is directed against LGBTQ individuals. And in 2020, the Human Rights Campaign reported 44 deaths of transgender and gender nonconforming people, which was more than any prior year since 2013, which is when they started reporting actually. And from 2017 to 2020, 75% of the known transgender homicide victims were Black, and 3/4 of murders of transgender people involved a gun. So as you can see, toxic masculinity is not only the root cause of many threats and murders of women across this country, and certainly for DV-related homicides or femicides, but also behind most mass shootings and behind many of the hate crimes against the LGBTQ community. And bigotry and racism leads to compounded victimization. Unfortunately, since the culture of toxic masculinity has also been strongly linked to our law enforcement and criminal justice officials, many victims of gender-based violent crimes really don't feel they can turn to these systems for safety or for justice. Now, a few years ago, I was interviewing one of the directors of one of the outreach centers in Chicago and asking him more about the causes of community gun violence they were dealing with. And I was so startled when he told me that he really felt about 60% of the day-to-day gun shootings that they were seeing in Chicago were not based on gang issues, but related to interpersonal conflicts. That is basically much of the violence started with intimate partner and family disputes with subsequent retaliation violence, including involving other family members. And he also said that many of the younger men from the west and south side areas of Chicago, which they supported, really didn't learn skills to handle conflict in any other ways than engaging in violence. And with firearms so readily accessible, gun violence was the end result. So here was now another connection of a significant number of firearm deaths and injuries, ultimately as a result of domestic violence, and another connection, in my opinion, to toxic masculinity. So this day-to-day community gun violence, it impacts, of course, entire neighborhoods and includes those who are not only directly involved in these domestic disputes, which can include children, but it also includes innocent bystanders and sometimes responding law officers as well. And communities are left traumatized. Families are left grieving, especially the mothers who have lost their children. And I witness their trauma almost every weekend at vigils, memorials, and survivor events in Chicago. So at this point, I want to be quite clear. Of course, not all men participate in toxic masculinity culture. But I do think for far too long, many men and also many women too have condoned this behavior and have not done enough to acknowledge the harm to society as a whole or to reject the acceptance of violence against women and gender nonconforming individuals. So without further ado, let's look at this connection in more depth with our panel of experts in both the historical and current intersections of gun violence to gender-based violence, and what we can do to reduce gun violence stemming from toxic masculinity, not only in our personal and professional lives, but also at larger societal levels. I am so thrilled to have our panelists today. I want to thank them so much for being here and to share their ideas and expertise with us on this difficult topic. I'm going to introduce them now. I'm going to start actually in reverse alphabetical order just to flip things around a little bit. So I'll start with Carbon, and Carbon was born and raised in Chicago and has spent years volunteering and organizing for many LGBT groups throughout the city. They now work as the assistant to the executive director at Brave Space Alliance, which provides educational and access-based programming specifically for the BIPOC, trans, and gender nonconforming community. Next, we have Maureen Lonane, who currently serves as the Executive Director of the Chicago Office of Facing History and Ourselves, an educational and professional development organization with global headquarters based in Boston and offices worldwide. Facing History's mission is to use the tools of history to challenge teachers and their students to stand up to racism, bigotry, and hate. Prior to joining Facing History, Maureen served as the Director of Development at the ACLU of Illinois. She began her career at the University of Chicago, first as Program Director and then Associate Director of the wonderful university's Posen Center for Human Rights. Tara Dabney, I included the wonderful, by the way. Tara Dabney is the Director of Development and Communications at the Institute Nonviolence Chicago. She moved to Chicago 20 years ago when she joined AmeriCorps and has committed to advocating for and supporting victims of violence in her entire professional career since. Tara has been a legal advocate, program coordinator, and director of development and communications for Family Rescue for over 11 years. She works with survivors of domestic violence. And prior to joining INVC, Tara was the Deputy Director of Victims Witness Unit of the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, where she and her team of 60 provided victim support and advocacy to family members of victims of homicide and other violent crimes. Celia Colon is an Emmy Award nominee, an author, an educator, and an inspirational speaker who is a progressive national social justice matter expert. She uses her unique life experiences to advocate and support legislative policies that advance smart criminal justice reform. And is a passionate community leader, a mentor, mother, grandmother, and organizer. She is reimagining what post-incarceration support looks like for women as the CEO and founder of Giving Others Dreams, a nonprofit organization that provides direct reentry services and holistic support for justice-impacted women. And that's the first of this kind in Chicago that's led by justice-impacted women. And she's also a 2020 Urban Scholar Fellow for the University of Illinois Chicago Jane Addams College of Social Work, a community task force member for the City of Chicago CPD Use of Force Working Group, and an Emmy Award nominee for her role in the documentary series, The Marshall Project, We Are Witnesses, Chicago. And last, I hope Kina joins us soon. I'm going to go ahead and introduce her and hope that she is able to.
Hey, I'm on, Tracy.
Oh, you are? I didn't see you. Okay, great. I'm so glad. Kina is a nationally recognized gun violence prevention and healthcare advocate who is from the Austin neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. She served on the National Leadership Council with Generation Progress, which brought young adults together from across the country to address the root causes of violence and criminal justice abuse. Kina also helped build a statewide coalition and co-authored landmark civil rights legislation that established the Illinois Council on Women and Girls in 2018. She served as the executive director for GPEC ICHV, one of the oldest and largest gun violence prevention nonprofits in Illinois, and was invited by President Biden's administration to serve as a stakeholder on the transition team for the federal GVP task force. Kina is now a candidate herself running for the U.S. House of Representatives for the 11th District of Illinois. Thank you again so much for all of you being here with us today. I'm going to go ahead and jump in right into questions, and you know, as you're answering questions, feel free to tell us a little bit more about your organizations and the work you're doing. But I did have so many questions I wanted to get to ask you all because I'm very interested to hear your answers and learn more myself. Maureen, I'm going to start with you actually for some historical context on the Second Amendment. I actually just recently heard Carol Anderson speak in promoting her book, The Second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. And I was so surprised to hear about the connection between the Second Amendment in our Constitution to white supremacy, basically as a concession to allow state militia control over slave rebellions. Quite honestly, that is not the way I learned history about the Second Amendment. So how do you see keeping power and control over others with this right established for the personal use of firearms? How has it evolved in the United States history to currently oppress certain groups of people, including women?
Tracy, first of all, I want to say thank you again for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I feel really honored to be with this group of panelists and to be speaking with all of the audience members who are on today. So thank you so much. And I think just a little bit more by way of Facing History's work. So as the bio that you read said, so Facing History and Ourselves is an education organization, and we train teachers to use the tools of history to help themselves and to help their students to stand up to racism, bigotry, and hatred. And the way that we do our work, the way that we begin to train teachers, we start with encouraging people to do a deep dive into their understanding of their own identities and all of their complexity, and then to think about how their identities impact the way that they exist in the world. You know, through their identities, what groups do they belong to, what groups do they not belong to, and how that has shifted throughout history. So before we dive into any history, we've always spent a lot of time trying to help people to humanize each other, humanize themselves and humanize each other. And I think that that is such an important piece of the work that you are trying to do. And I think that all of the panelists are trying to do, right? This is very much about trying to help people to understand that we are all human beings and deserving of human rights. And I think particularly for women. I think the other thing that I wanted to say is, and Tracy, thank you so much for starting off with definitions. And I wanted to add another definition that I think is so important, which is to make sure when we talk about white supremacy that we all have kind of a shared definition. And so the definition actually that I want to just read with you all is from Martin Luther King's 1967 book that I have right here called Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? And so the way that Dr. King speaks about white supremacy, I think is really, really instructive. He says, you know, generally we think of white supremacist views as having their origins with the unlettered, underprivileged, poor class whites, but it's actually the birth of racist views in our country were from the aristocracy, from rich merchants, influential clergymen, men of medical science, historians, and political scientists. And the doctrine of white supremacy was embedded in every textbook and preached in practically every pulpit. It became a structural part of the culture. And men then embraced this philosophy not only as the rationalization of a lie, but as the expression of a final truth. So I think it's so important to understand white supremacy as you know, a structural and cultural issue that we all have to grapple with. And then Tracy, as you were alluding to, that understanding white supremacy and misogyny, those two are so intertwined, and I really feel like that's what you're trying to get at. So thank you so much for mentioning Carol Anderson's book. I think it's hugely important, and encourage people to put it on their summer reading list. It's an intense book, but I think understanding that history, that part of the calculus of creating a Second Amendment was that these white men wanted to make sure that they could control Black slaves. They wanted to make sure that they had the firepower to combat against slave rebellion. So I think, you know, having that as a framing of why we, you know, have been so insistent from our founding of having this right to bear arms is critically important. And then you can trace that, the need for white men to have arms throughout history. And you look at all of the racial violence that occurred in the summer of 1919, right? And the history of that is something that our country really has only begun to understand and grapple with. And the reality of what the historical context of that, right, is that for the first time, Black men were coming back from having been soldiers in World War I, fighting for democracy for this country, coming back to a country and being told, you are no longer a soldier here. You no longer even have the dignity of being a citizen. And so those Black men had felt empowered, and they had learned how to fight. So the white population were very alarmed by that and did all they could to suppress it. And there was just tremendous violence across the country at that time, where you know, thousands upon thousands of dollars in terms of Black wealth were destroyed, not to mention hundreds and thousands of people, Black people, who were killed at that time. So that's, you know, one big historical marker. And then jumping to the Black Panthers, right? So in the late 60s, the Black Panthers also wanting to take power, to equalize things, and the response, and you know, a big in 1967 in California, the Mulford Act was passed with the cooperation of the NRA, signed by, at the time, Governor Ronald Reagan, the Mulford Act repealed a law allowing public carrying of firearms. So in California, it had been okay to publicly carry firearms, except the Black Panthers started to publicly carry firearms, and that could not go forward. So the NRA, in cooperation with Republican legislators, passed this law to make sure that the Black people could not bear arms. So I think, you know, there are just so many instances where you really can see that intersection of white supremacy and you know, the need to control violence in that way. And again, you know, we all can assume that that is very much white males going, you know, throughout history who were insistent on having that kind of power.
Yeah, and thank you. You did really spell out that a big view I have of this is that connection, and a very integral component of white supremacy is the idea of you know, misogyny and a lot of the toxic masculinity and how it really
Yes.
intersects with all of these conditions. And then again, kind of the compounding of victimization, particularly, you know, for individuals who have multiple ways that they are seen as other, quote unquote.
Yes. Yes.
So Tara, I'm going to actually turn to you next, because you work at, of course, Institute Nonviolent Chicago, which utilizes street outreach workers who are trained in Kingian nonviolent strategies, and you also provide services to reduce day-to-day gun violence, including gun violence. You also come from the background, of course, of domestic violence service. And last year, with the COVID-19 shelter-in-place orders issued, what did you see was the impact on the women you serve in regards to domestic violence reports, your outreach efforts? And we also do know that DV reports to police increased in 2020. And so given what we know about that connection between domestic violence and gun violence, do you feel that some of the increased numbers of shootings that we saw last year in Chicago may actually have been also more connected to domestic violence conflicts?
So thanks for having me, Tracy. I want to start just with telling people a little bit about the Institute for Nonviolence Chicago. We were founded in 2016, and we are working to break the cycles of violence that continue to devastate our communities, particularly Austin, West Garfield Park, back of the yards, and most recently Brighton Park. And we do that through a holistic continuum of care. So many people have heard of violence interrupters, and what we do is we go a little further, right? So we have street outreach workers who we hire from within those communities who know people in that community to really impact how we respond to violence. We're notified by the police department of every shooting and homicide in those communities, and we respond immediately with street outreach to try to keep situations calm at the scene, and also notify our trauma-informed, very well-trained victim advocates to respond either to the scene or to the hospital, provide support to victims and their families. And then we continue along with people along that road. It's very difficult, and as you mentioned, Tracy, even more difficult in 2020 and 2021 because of the pandemic and because our communities have been so historically disinvested in. And then even the schools were taken away, right? So we had nothing for our young people to do. So our case management team and our reentry case managers really held on tightly to those folks, help them find jobs, get a GED, get a driver's license, whatever we could do. And often in these past 2 years, that's been providing food and diapers and rental assistance and help with getting stimulus money. Because folks who were incarcerated, who don't have a conviction, were still eligible, but if they weren't out, there wasn't an address, you know. So really working with individuals to help them meet them where they are and help them get out of a life of violence. All of this is based on Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s steps and principles of nonviolence and his conflict mediation process. During this time, we have also developed a partnership or strengthened our partnership with Sarah's Inn, which is a domestic violence agency that serves individuals primarily on the south and west sides. But they have really helped us, and we're working to do cross trainings with both agencies around recognizing community violence and domestic violence. They also have a partner abuse intervention program. We know if you look at numbers, just raw numbers, there was an increase in domestic violence. There's also an increase in community violence. We believe at the Institute, and not just we believe, but we know that often, as you mentioned in your opening, Tracy, these are cross-referenced, right? So that often what starts out as a domestic violence situation will spill over into the streets, or is a driver for community violence. So perhaps a couple gets into an argument, and then one of them, calls their brother or their cousin, and then it becomes bigger, and it is reported as gang violence. It's often, that's not the core, right? What the core is that domestic violence is often a driver for community violence. And we are excited because now we're seeing these cross collaborations. So we also work with a group called Lifespan, which has works with us around recognizing when sex workers might be in need of help, or are sexually assaulted or are being trafficked. So our outreach workers can help to identify some of the things that that they haven't been trained to identify in the past. So we're trying to see this more holistically, understanding that if we can have services on site and maintain confidentiality for victims of domestic violence, because we understand that is different than the work that we have historically done, that we can really make a bigger impact in our communities as a whole. Whether that is domestic violence or community violence, it's still layers of trauma that impact families and are intergenerational. I mean, research has shown us now that trauma not only, passes on from generation to generation, but there are physical impacts that pass on from generation to generation. And so we really aim to break those cycles in a variety of ways. And we are in partnership with groups all over the city, with Communities Partnering for Peace. That's now in 15 communities that have over 80% of gun violence, where over 80% of the gun violence occurs. We work with Ready Chicago to provide transitional jobs and cognitive behavioral therapy for folks who are most at risk of gun violence. And we work with Chicago CRED. So I guess I want to say, I'm very proud to work for the Institute for Nonviolence Chicago. I'm equally as proud of the city for coming together and the nonprofits we work with. We are finally funded at the level that New York and LA have been funded. And so I think now we can really see some significant changes moving forward. I'm hopeful, at least.
Yeah, and that's great. And thank you for also mentioning some of those other wonderful organizations in our city that work with sexual violence, domestic violence, and human trafficking. And it's so good to hear about how well your services and the other street outreach organizations are starting to integrate this and work with the other organizations real collaboratively. And also bringing services like you mentioned into the communities, which haven't always been there. So having that connection to a site that they're very familiar with, that then they're getting this additional trauma-informed care piece of it is wonderful. There is concerning data out there that lesbian women, bisexual, and transgender individuals are also reporting very high rates of lifetime intimate partner violence compared to the hetero and cisgender population. And in fact, 54% of transgender adults have experienced some form of intimate partner violence in their lifetime from a 2015 survey. So Carbon, I wanted to ask you what your thoughts were on these intersections of domestic violence in the LGBT community, along with the risk of gun violence for those individuals. And how does your organization, Brave Space Alliance, kind of support your members of the community that are at risk?
First, I'm happy to be here, and I would like to introduce my organization, but I have to hop off at 1 o'clock due to a conflict. So I would suggest everybody could just go to bravespacealliance.org and find out about the work we do. But I think that the data does suggest that individuals report higher rates, and I think that is due to the queer community is just more likely to speak up for themselves. The domestic violence goes underreported, goes vastly underreported, as we know. However, the queer community as a whole makes much more space for survivors, and we see much less tolerance for abusers, and accountability is held to a higher standard. So we don't see people as disposable, as we originally did at the beginning of cancer culture, but we are now more working with a community justice type of reform process, where if somebody is a abuser or perpetrates domestic violence, we attempt to go through a whole restorative justice process to hold them accountable, to make sure that they get the help from the trauma that they carry within themselves to heal from that. And Race-Based Alliance intentionally practices community-based justice and offers resource and will connect people to resources around community restorative justice practices. And then if people who are not part of the LGBT POC community want to support that, I think intentionally redistributing your privilege is how people who do not identify as queer and do not identify as POC people of color can help. And so Race-Based Alliance has a huge focus on making sure that our comrades, not our allies, comrades, people who are in the trenches with us, somebody who would physically put their body between us and a cop and strategically use the resources that they have, is what we define as a comrade, to help us and make sure that we are able to provide these resources. So I think that the queer community is reporting more because it's just less tolerated.
Okay, that's really interesting. And actually you kind of luckily answered in your answer to this question when I was going to ask you later. So since you have to jump off early, that's great. I think I'm going to go ahead so that we can hear more from you before you head out. Just ask one more question of you that I had. And as you could see from the slides, hate is obviously way more deadly when a firearm is involved. And we certainly read the horrible stats on hate crimes and gun violence impacting your community, especially transgender women. And I think as of last week, there'd already been 29 reported murders of transgender individuals. Of course, we know that's probably an underreporting due to misgendering in the police reports. But can you speak to that particular form of gun violence that just so clearly demonstrates kind of that intersection of misogyny, racism, homo and transphobia? And also, I'm just curious why you feel like there might be a higher incidence of gun violence murders for transgender women, particularly Black women, as compared to transgender men.
So I'm going to start with the discrepancy between transgender women and transgender men. I think that with the discrepancy in the numbers with transgender men, it's a tendency not to acknowledge their transness, which is an example of misogyny that goes along with being assigned female at birth. But I believe the numbers are pretty even if they were reported accurately. Second, trans women are more visible, and with that visibility comes more danger. And then back to the other question of trans Black women facing more gun violence. Or not facing more gun violence, but facing gun violence. I think I'm going to talk about inter-community violence. However, I need to acknowledge that this problem is indicative of a larger we need to acknowledge that this problem is indicative of a larger social issue. White supremacy and misogyny noir, which is different than misogyny, because the misogyny that white women face is not the same misogyny that Black women face and Black trans women face, and misogyny noir both misogyny noir heavily impacts Black trans women who are both targeted and affected the most by misogyny noir and white supremacy. I would say that the Black on Black violence, which is what it usually is. If a trans woman is murdered, it's usually by another Black person that they were dating, that they were involved with, that they were friends with, something, or a family member, something like that. The Black on Black violence that you ask about that plays the Black community is a product of the racism that has historically and constantly been destroying the Black community. And anytime the Black community builds itself up, like Maureen said earlier, white supremacy is always there to tear it down. So such as Black Wall Street and the places that we now call New York, white supremacy wiped out the Black communities that existed, and the black power that we had, and does that over and over and over again. White supremacy keeps the Black community fighting itself in a form of control and power to keep the community from gaining and leveraging its power. This is beneficial to white supremacy not only for racist reasons, but also economic exploitation of the Black body in the community, keeping us in poverty and desperation, which breeds violence, furthers the current American elite and the lineage of white power. So when we see trans women facing more gun violence and facing more murders, it is indicative of that desperation, that violence, and overall white supremacy and misogyny war.
Yeah, I really think you completely nailed that, which is how interconnected with the whole system of white supremacy, systemic racism, as you said, the Black on Black violence, and then how a lot of these incidents, again, kind of come back and tie back into domestic violence or misogyny incidents, and perhaps explaining maybe some of the discrepancies there. But I hear what you're saying too, that also might be a little bit of a observational bias, meaning Black trans women being a little bit more obvious potentially than trans men. And I think you actually kind of hit upon the last question I had for you specifically, but if I do want to ask if there's any other intersections of gun violence and gender-based violence to the LGBT community that you felt like you didn't touch upon, and feel free to do that now. And I think you also really answered what we can do as allies to better support the community in our personal lives as well. But are there also any policies or organizations that you would suggest that we support that also would help in the violence that and hate crimes that you're experiencing?
So with the redistributing your privilege and, saying, again, we don't need allies, we need comrades. That is more of what everybody can do. More police will not solve the problem. Not everybody. When we bring up these issues, I find that people are quick to jump to, we need more police, and more police will not solve the problem. We need more community councils, we need more community justice, we need an inside out approach. And I think that would help and better what is going on. I think that in POC communities, there's a silence for the sake of the movement or for the sake of the family. Martin Luther King was a known abuser, but nobody reported him for the sake of the movement. And the queer community here is not actively trying to hide abusers. The queer community gives us examples of how to handle abuse. We don't come from a place of seeing abusers as disposable. We come from a place of trying to figure out why they are committing these acts and rehabilitating them. And I think that really focusing on doing a double-pronged approach would help with domestic violence. We focus a lot on the survivors of domestic violence, getting them away from the immediate situation, healing their initial trauma, but the abuser is only going to go on to repeat the abusive acts and find more victims unless we stop them, and prison is not going to stop them. Rehabilitation is going to stop them. And as far as getting gun violence under control, we could do that. That's a policy issue. Other countries have done that. And as long as we allow the gun lobbyists to control the narrative, we are never going to make any progress. So I feel that it is completely and physically possible for us to have gun reform by the end of the year if we took it out of the hands of the NRA and the Republican Party.
I hear you. All right. Well, thank you so much for really putting all of that together and highlighting.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and highlighting also, I think, something that I was not covering as well during this talk, but I think is also important, which is you're right, that the criminal justice system is not always going to be the solution to this problem, because abusers can still come out of jail if they even end up in jail. And probably it's only going to make them a worse abuser in the long run. So doing some community, trying to do some community interventions and rehabilitation is probably more important in the long run for preventing more victims in the future. So thank you for including that as well.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks. Kina, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're a busy lady too, and I know you also have many connections to survivors of gun violence as well, and you're so involved in the West Side neighborhoods from which you come from and which have some of the highest gun violence in our city. So I just was curious, just kind of in a general sense, what you feel regarding some of these shootings that we've been seeing, including family members and children, and if you tie in or see a connection to toxic masculinity, some of the larger, things we've been talking about and connections to racism as well. And that's my question for you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then I just wanted to correct one thing. I'm running for Congress in the Illinois 7, not the Illinois 11. But
sorry, yes.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I grew up and was born and raised in the Austin neighborhood. And even when we look at this current district, that we're specifically talking about, it encompasses 10 of the most violent neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, which account for 50% of all the gun violence that we're seeing across the city of Chicago. Of course, toxic masculinity has something to do with it. And exactly what Carbon was just talking about, the lack of investment in prevention instead of reaction. And so to expand a little bit on their point about the over-policing and over-militarization of Black and Brown communities, let me just give you a quick snapshot. Just in the Austin neighborhood alone, $100 million a year is spent on incarcerating adults. So that we call them $1 million blocks. So imagine what that $100 million could be doing for communities like Austin. And that's just one neighborhood. The biggest conversation that we continue to miss in this talk about gun violence is the intersection of gender-based violence and how it is intricately linked to women and girls, particularly in Black and Brown communities. There's a group that talks about femicide of Black girls and women. So when we think of a Jaslyn Adams, the 7-year-old girl who shot 6 times as she sat in a drive-through with her father in McDonald's, she is experiencing the byproducts of the violence that is happening oftentimes amongst the men in our community. And when you think of stories like Rakia Boyd, who was shot in the face by an off-duty police officer, that is also gun violence in our community. And that the reason why these stories have obtained, I can say their names out loud, Jaslyn, I can say Rakia out loud, I can claim space for them, it's because there was a viral consumption of Black outrage and outcry that shamed the justice system into making sure that we were pushing them into the forefront. So the first thing is, it's a culture problem of guns in the United States of America, and that it is easy to pawn the responsibility off to communities that have traditionally and historically not just been cut off from the resources, but have been starved of the resources. When we talk and have a larger conversation about gun violence and mass shootings, immediately when it's a white male, and it typically is a young, homegrown, self-radicalized young white man with a gun, the pivot is immediately to stigmatize the mental health community. And that is, we need to stop that. We need to stop stigmatizing mental health as a reason that violence is occurring, and start talking about the root causes of how these things happen and how the system fails to prevent these things from happening, prevent these shootings from happening. But to go back to the point about mental health, if it is so that we are linking mental health to mass shootings that occur, why is it that every mental health facility is shut down on the west side and south side of the city of Chicago? Why is it that Cook County Jail is the largest mental health facility in the city of Chicago, in these neighborhoods. And so that is a real question that people on the outside, when they use Chicago as this political punching bag around gun violence, and namely and particularly on the West Side and South Side, we don't talk about. And so I couldn't agree more about the first thing is identifying the culture of guns in our country and how it is we have to shift that. Secondly is holding folks accountable that they are not being bought and paid for by the gun lobby, which does a lot to make sure that they push their messaging out. The fourth thing in that branch of accountability is, you know, when we do talk about police officers and law enforcement, they actually have to enforce the laws. So it's great that we got bio bill passed. It's great that we have gun dealer certification to put a check and balance on gun shops and gun manufacturers. But if police officers and law enforcement are not inspecting gun shops and gun manufacturers and holding them accountable, then what good is the law? And so we have to make sure folks are holding that accountable. We're holding folks accountable. And then finally, I think you're 100% right, Tracy, is continuing this conversation of gender-based violence intersecting with gun violence and how that occurs.
Yeah, and I thank you also, and we'll talk a little bit more about legislation because there might be people on the call here who are not as familiar with some of the laws that have passed recently, and Illinois really has done some good work in this area. But you're right. I think, you know, again, if that culture is not there, and unfortunately the culture in law enforcement is still so, in some ways, tied to that white supremacy background from which it comes, it's hard to encourage people to understand the importance of they have to then go the next step and actually work on, you know, acquiring or repossessing weapons that people who should not be owning them have. And thank you again.
Tracy, can I say
yeah,
one more thing? I'm sorry. Just to pull out your question about how is it linked on the West Side and South Side in toxic masculinity? For years, folks like you, Tracy, and other people who are on this call, who were in the DV space, who were in the gun violence prevention space, who are fighting against gender-based violence, were yelling to the top of your lungs about the guns in homes that women face. You read the statistic of women being 5 times more likely to be shot in a domestic dispute. No one knew COVID was coming. So what we saw was a spike in domestic violence because survivors were forced to shelter in place with their domestic abusers. So there's ramifications when we don't listen to scaling public health models. It's not that Carbon is just saying, just saying this willy-nilly about more police is not going to help. No, there are layers to this conversation of public safety and public health. And advocates like you and other people in this space were talking about this 10 years ago before COVID ever happened. And so how many lives were lost because we didn't remove those firearms out of the hands of people who were harming their children, harming survivors, and just harming their folks who were around them. So I just wanted to say that.
No, and you're absolutely right. I often say it was almost like a double gut punch when COVID hit for those of us who are working both in health equity causes and, unfortunately dragging, our feet, I would say, in my opinion, on making advances in health equity. And then also the gun violence prevention movement, which has not been dragging its feet, has been quite active and successful. It's just we're really hindered by fighting against, politicians that are basically bought by the NRA or had been in the past at least. So actually I'm going to move on. Thank you, Keen. I'm going to move on to Celia. I just want real quickly to honor your sister Guadalupe Lopez, who was killed last year while she was driving her car on the South Side. And not only was she your sister, she was the wonderful mother to 2 young children. And I'm hoping it's okay to ask you a pretty deep kind of personal question as to if you connect in any way your sister's loss to this culture of toxic masculinity, or if that's too close to home, what you've witnessed in other stories of women in your women survivors in your South Side neighborhoods that are so greatly impacted as well by gun violence.
Well, first, I'd like to just thank you for inviting me to this conversation. It is, a very touchy subject, but a subject that must be talked about. Kind of wanted to talk about my non-for-profit GOD because I deal with a lot of women, that are victims of a lot of multiple layers of harms and traumas. When I think about all of these conversations and these panel discussions, and everybody's always asking the magical question, how to stop the violence. The reduction of violence happens when we get deep investments in our communities, right? Get great quality care and support. A lot of times, people are always thinking about action items. And at the end of the day, we have to think about the heart, right? We have to think about the emotional and social harms that have been bestowed upon us for generations to come and generations before me. Black and brown people have never been taught, not even in schools are there mandatory curriculums about healing and wellness and what that feels like to have support. We deal with trauma day in, day out, created by white supremacy, created by misogyny, created by toxic, masculinity. And, there's so many things I could piggyback off of what all of these wonderful ladies have said. They've hit the nail on the head in so many different topics. I live in the southeast side of Chicago, and I tell people, when you talk about, the criminal, right? The criminal that comes home, these people, I am one of these people, right? 92% of us come home. People want to label us criminals, but no one ever wants to talk about who created that criminal. Your environment breaks you or makes you. These environments were made for us not to thrive, but to survive and to create violence. I tell people a lot of times, as a historian that's on this phone would appreciate, I know everything about the Black Belt. People even my age and even older sometimes don't even know about that it existed here in Illinois. That's why a lot of us Black and brown people do live on the South Side. We were never allowed to live anywhere else, right? Ghettos didn't create themselves. If in my neighborhood, all these little Mexican, corner stores, if they didn't exist, I would have food deserts, but no one thinks about the structural violence that I see every day in my neighborhood in South Chicago. You go down Commercial Avenue, all the stores close at 6 or 7 o'clock with gates. Liquor stores stay open till 2 in the morning on every other corner. Pawn shop stays open with blinking lights till midnight. Before COVID, the plasma center would stay open till 9. This is all violence to me against my people in my community, but no one wants to take that into consideration. They talk about, Kina spoke on the $1 million blocks. What if we put $1 million in our blocks, right? How would that change the narrative? There's so many people walking around with unhealed trauma. There's so many people that's never been taught how to process and deal with pain. Hurt people, end of the day. Everybody, there's great people doing great work, but everybody forgets the main thing. You have to meet them where they're at. You have to knock on their door. You have to come to them. I mean, how much data and articles are published that they tell you, no one can tell you how you're going to heal from trauma. And at the end of the day, as a survivor, we live with trauma for the rest of our lives. Even after counseling, even after we know we're safe, we live with that. No one can ever remove what I had to see, right? I had to visually, and that's something that I plan to change for the city of Chicago. I had to visually, because my sister was a homicide case, go and see her with a gunshot wound to her head, not cleaned up because it's a medical examiner's office and not the morgue, right? That shouldn't have been the last thing that I saw. Some people never come back from that. I shouldn't have had to receive her clothes from her crime scene given to me without a label, without a warning. I had to open them with her blood, pieces of her brain matter stuck to glass. I shouldn't have been through that. And there's people that go through that every day. So when you want to talk about violence, that is violence perpetrated by systems that are not in place to look at us, Black and brown people, as credible victims, right? People need to look at the heart, look at the social emotional harms and start repairing that. That's how you repair the world, by repairing the people. Give me 1 second. I need a little bit of tissue. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's so hard to hear what you had to endure and go through as
And
the
it's not
family
just me.
member that had to
Every
see.
time there's a murder in the city of Chicago, I want everybody on this call to know people are going through that. People that look like me, who don't have a support system, who don't know how to ever deal with this. And what do people do? They numb themselves with any way they know how. They get involved in things that they shouldn't, because I had no one there. I was given a card and say, here, call somebody if you need some help. What is that going to do for me when I'm falling apart, right? You can't prepare people for that. And is it related to toxic masculinity? Yes. My sister was involved in a relationship that wasn't healthy. She was in an abusive relationship. I believe that she was killed due to the byproduct of violence between men. You know, the car that she was driving was her boyfriend's.
Boy.
You know, known drug dealer, very visible car.
Mhm.
It was like a hit. Only the driver's seat was hit, and he was actually in the car, and he didn't get harmed. She was driving. So yes, it was tied to that. You know, and it's sad because there's so many women that I can think about that are sitting in prison right now because of that are survivors. I myself spent my whole youth in prison. I've been home for 20 years, and that's how my non-for-profit got started, GOD. I became what I needed when I came home, because there was no support. 25 years later, there still isn't much support for Black and brown women. I serve the South Side and the West Side because at any given day, 26,000 people are released from IODC every day, and they come back to 5 neighborhoods on the West Side and on the South Side. That's what happens. And what we do, because I uniquely understand the permanent punishments that they will face, and their children will face, and their grandchildren will face, because of this punitive racist system that exists in the United States across this nation. No one talks about those things, the generational harms and the barriers that our children face because we once had a record. My case is sealed, but I still don't call myself a returning citizen. I still don't have all my civil rights. I want to know if I could file a lawsuit against the United States, right? I still can't own a gun. I still can't run for office. There's a lot of, I can't be a police officer. Until I got my case sealed, I was denied to be a parent. They try to make my child wear my number. My daughter graduated from 8th grade, and they told me that I couldn't volunteer, I couldn't chaperone, and I couldn't be a mom. So at that moment, they were making my child wear my number. Wasn't even a thought in my eye when I went to prison at 18 years old. I'm 45 years old. What if she never even knew of that part of my journey in life? Who are they to share that and traumatize her? And then who's going to help her with counseling when everybody in the school is bullying her because her mom can't come because her mom has a record, right? There's thousands of students who don't have a parent in their classroom, not because they don't want to, because their parent don't even want to fill out the application because they don't want to get embarrassed that they cannot volunteer at their kid's school. That alone creates a prison to pipeline. Then we have teachers who are privileged, who like to talk about us and say that we're irresponsible and we don't care about our kids. But yet right now in the United States in 2021, Black women and brown women only make 63% to the dollar to the white man. You want to talk about toxic masculinity, white supremacy, there it is. And that still hasn't changed. So when we have to work 2 or 3 jobs and we can't take off work to go to the school to pick up the report card or to attend a play or to chaperone, how dare you down talk us and shame us and put guilt on us for something we have no control over, because we can't even have a living wage so that we can be moms. That's the problem with America. Right now, 700% has risen of locking women up in prison. Right. That's what's missing. We're the village keepers. We're the glue to the communities. We're the healers. We're the first teachers to our babies. Everybody deals with the woman from in the womb when they're born. It's usually women nurses, doctors, caregivers, preschool teachers. All of that is usually women. When somebody's emotionally hurt, I don't care how old you are, they're looking for a sister, a mom, a grandma, they're looking for a woman. We want to stop violence. If a woman hasn't created and committed a heinous crime where she needs to be institutionalized in a mental facility because she harms herself and others, women shouldn't be in prison. 70% of the people in prison are due to drug offenses, which is actually due from poverty, right? From violence. So when we talk about stopping the violence, let's start supporting women. Let's start helping women. And that's what we do with GOD. We show up to them. I have what's called a We Win Welcome Home Care package, where women reach out to me. I do an assessment to find out how many people live in their house. Because not only am I serving the woman, I'm serving that whole family. Because if you're coming back to the South Side and the West Side, our economics haven't changed. If anything, it's gotten worse because of COVID. So no, I don't have extra laundry soap for that lady that just came home. I don't have an extra bath loofah to give her. So we come to them with about $700 worth of items to help them with their first month home, not just for them, but for their family. Hygiene products, tissue, tampons, soap, things you take for granted, those kind of things. It changes the world, right? That little kind ripple effect changes the world when you show up at somebody's house. So and you're in the hood and you have the village shows up and it's people that look just like you and say, hey, sis, I'm going to take your hand. No disparities, no judgment. I'm going to pray for your success. I'm going to give you tools. I'm going to help you and enhance your emotional intelligence, your social intelligence, right? So that you're empowered, so that you heal, and then you heal your family, right? I plan to create what we do. I would say 95% of people that go through my program, they never go back. They become a part of my team. We truly reduce the recidivism rate and violence against women. I create a safe village of support and healers that is there for generations to come.
Celia, what I'm hearing from you definitely is some hurt people heal people. That is you. And there's hurt people out there that, it's not necessarily overcoming their circumstances completely, but are working with what they have to help heal others in the community. And I'll hold you in such high regard because of what you have done. And then I also strongly hear that connection again, right? Toxic masculinity, but really it tying back into systems in place, right? Our governmental systems, our criminal justice systems, our ability for employment, really across the board, all of this really tying into a very violent system that's harming people, particularly from Black and Brown communities, but really all others, I would say, as well. And I wanted to this is actually a good segue to ask Tara a question about one of the other things that the outreach workers had said to me is that for many of the young men in their program, that they felt like many of them really didn't want to live with that fear and almost an expectation that they were going to end up with a violent death, and that had they had other options or resources, that they would put down the guns if they felt like they could feel safe as well. And I really just see this as such another tragedy of the impact of not only this longstanding disinvestment and systemic racism, but again, combined with that toxic masculinity culture on men who really feel trapped into violence. And I'm just curious, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but a little bit more about how the street outreach worker centers, I don't know why I struggle so much with that term, how they're working really with the perpetrators of some of these violent acts and turning that culture around and giving more opportunities to them to find other sources of power and control.
Yeah, thank you. And Celia, thank you for your work. I'm so sorry for your loss. I wish that my coworkers had been there to respond when this happened to your sister. I know we're not working in your neighborhood, but I worked in South Chicago for the first 11 years of my professional career. I love Commercial Avenue. I marched down it every October in the March Against Domestic Violence. So I want to say that and just to honor you and appreciate you for the work that you're doing as a survivor in this space. I think that, and Tracy, I understand toxic masculinity and believe in that. I think when I'm talking to my coworkers who are overwhelmingly male, I say, or male identified, I say, we really want to build a culture of healthy masculinity, and they don't want to have to carry a gun. They don't. people do not want to have to carry a gun to feel safe. It's a shame that we see the numbers, that gun sales are on the rise so much because people feel unsafe and they feel like the only way for safety is to carry a gun. I believe, and Celia, I'm going to piggyback a little bit on what you said, that if you meet people where they are, so they don't have to go to the medical examiner's office by themselves, they don't have to go to the morgue by themselves, they don't have to go to the funeral home by themselves. And if you build those relationships, and at the Institute for Nonviolence Chicago, one of the things we've worked so hard on, and we're still working on, is building relationships with hospitals and law enforcement so we can have access to people in the moment of their greatest hurt, right? Because we have the training and the experience. One of the things that's left off my bio is I grew up in a funeral home, right? My coworkers, we've all experienced horrific death and loss in our lives. And we really want to give back to our communities and help to address that trauma when it happens, much like in domestic violence situations, where if you can get to someone in that first 24 hours after they've been victimized, they're much more likely to leave, much more likely to accept services. It's the same with victims of violence, right? If families and folks who are either perpetrators or victims, and I believe many of our perpetrators of violence have also, I don't believe it, I know it, have also been victimized by violence, right? It's a vicious cycle of violence that continues to impact. And so I don't want to blame, but I know that if we can help people get into those partner intervention programs, if we can help people connect with my coworkers who have previous incidents of violence in their background and who have come out of that and said, no more, I want to build my community from within, right? We don't see, and I say this as a white woman, like we do not see ourselves as saviors of any kind, but I want to take the lead from the people in BIPOC communities who have been so impacted by systems, by individuals, by redlining, and I know the person before that they said Dr. King was a known abuser. I understand that. I think that we take his steps and principles and we take the love that we believe we all need to have for our communities to really help people put the guns down. I mean, I have coworkers who have literally intervened in instances and said, let me take your gun, right? Because we know if we can get that out of the equation for 10 seconds, right? It's like cognitive behavioral therapy we do with folks to help them take that break. I know it sounds silly and we all grew up with like count to 10, but that's real, right? That's real. If you can get people in that immediate situation. And so we have people on the streets on call 24/7 to really help people feel like they don't have to carry a gun. But we're gonna need investment. We're gonna need investment. I'm gonna keep saying that. To sustained investment in cities where this has worked, like New York and LA, they have over 10 years of $30+ million investment into communities. We just this year got that much from Chicago, right? We have to keep building this infrastructure and we have to make sure that voices like Celia's are included in this infrastructure because survivor voices are some of the most important voices we have. And so that's how you get people, that's how you help people to feel like they don't have to carry guns. That's how you help people build healthy masculinity. So I hope that answered your question, Tracy. I feel like I did that in a broader way, but I really want to be inclusive and thoughtful when thinking about these things and stay away from blaming and naming. Not naming, but name calling, because I really do think that toxic masculinity has such a hold on our culture that much like racism, it goes so, under the radar that folks don't even realize what it is. So don't even realize that history, like Maureen was talking about, that history of racism, a history of toxic masculinity that has infiltrated all of our systems.
Right. No, I appreciate you expanding upon that too, other than just, uniquely what you're doing. And it's just so critical, this concept of investment in communities too. And it's good to hear we are at the rates of LA and New York. I didn't realize we had gotten the amount up to that high for Chicago, but you're continuing that year after year is really going to be critical. So this is ways that our participants today, stand up for putting funds aside again, instead of money going into incarceration and prisons, we need it going into the communities. And so speaking out to our, city leaders and our state leaders about the importance of these investments and keeping them sustained for a period of time, because 1 year, of course, is not going to solve all the problems. So
And
I'm gonna,
sorry, Tracy,
yeah,
can I piggyback on that a little bit? I saw a question from Angie D'Souza in the chat about employing restorative and community justice dynamics in dealing with domestic violence. I don't know if there's anyone else that is going to address this. I want to say that this is something that we're looking at in our partnership with Sarah Zinn and trying to figure out how we can do that more successfully, and are still having conversations around that. So I think this is something where I am trying to defer the, I think that the domestic violence community has a voice that I want to hear on that, and that in the community violence realm, we're trying to listen and see how we can make that work, right? We do some restorative justice practices with community violence, and we have like even courts that talk about that in Austin, but I think we really need the domestic violence community's voice in this, and I don't want to speak for anyone, so I don't want her to think that this question's going that's being ignored.
thank you for seeing that and catching it. All right, so I'm going to move a little bit up to a different topic, and I think for a lot of Americans, you know, myself formerly, when I first joined Moms Demand Action not too long ago, when we would think about gun violence, it really was more of the media covered mass shootings, many of which are obviously related to hate crimes, such as the Tree of Life synagogue shooting a couple years ago. Now, this past year in Atlanta, 6 Asian women were killed when a mass shooter targeted the local massage parlors in Atlanta. And the reality is the vast majority, of course, of mass shootings, as we all know now, are carried out by men. And one of the common traits among them is hatred towards women. And I want to make clear again that the day-to-day mass shootings, again, that we're seeing across the country that do target communities across the country are really the result of domestic and gender-based violence, such as things like stalking, and absolutely disproportionately harm Black, Latina, and Indigenous women. But I do want to turn to Maureen. The AAPI community, which encompasses peoples with origins from South, Southeast, South Central, Western and Eastern Asia, as well as the Pacific Islands, you know, an incredibly diverse people and cultures in that group. But I'm just curious, Maureen, if you're aware of ways that some of these communities, particularly in the Chicago area, may also be impacted by the intersecting experiences of domestic violence, gender-based violence, and gun violence. And then second, how do you see particular misogynistic beliefs about women from certain heritage, such as Asian and American Pacific Islanders, might play a role in some of these targeted attacks that we've seen against Asian women?
Yeah, Tracy, thank you for the question. And I do think, you know, there is so much intersection with all of the things that we're talking about. You know, to go back and do just a quick little bit of history, I think the sociologist Edward Said in the late 70s really did groundbreaking work trying to define what Orientalism meant in the West, going back, you know, to the 18th century, and the way that the Occident, the Western world, began to define itself as against, you know, either you were Occidental or Oriental. And if in the Occident, you know, we think about Western Enlightenment rational culture, then the Orient was then the mysterious, the feminine, and the physical. And so, you know, if you think going back centuries then of these types of stereotypes existing, then certainly when you know, you move forward in the world or throughout history, that Asian women are then, you know, if they come from a part of the world that is already seen as feminine as opposed to the masculine and rational West, then women in that already feminized space are hyper feminized and therefore hyper subservient. And you see that, you know, through like big cultural pieces like Madame Butterfly, that you know, that women are subservient, that they are there to completely to serve male desire. And you know, you take that type of stereotype. And I think, you know, another piece of all of the things that we are talking about intersecting. We talk about misogyny and toxic masculinity intersecting with white supremacy. I think another important thing that we need to think about is militarization and how the military intersects with all of those things. So thinking then about World War II and the wars that our country has been engaged in since then, and the way that particularly in Asian countries, there were very robust sex trades happening in the communities around US military bases, so that so often young American GIs, their first experiences with sex come in these sex trade industries that are there and completely objectifying and dehumanizing Asian women. So we have all of those cultural tropes that exist, and I think we have all seen them throughout growing up in this country, how Asian women are completely sexualized and completely made subservient. So then when the terrible shootings that happened in Atlanta occurred, it was personally shocking to me that that people tried to say that it wasn't a racist killing, that whereas for me it was obviously clear that there was very much an intersection of misogyny and racism occurring there. So I think that understanding that history and how that history plays into our culture is so important in this. And then certainly in domestic violence, I hope that many of you are aware of the wonderful organization called Apnagar that works on the north side of Chicago and services not only the Asian American population here, but also the refugee population and many other recent immigrants to our country, and the amazing work that they're doing. I think with so many of the statistics that are cited, the Asian American statistics are woefully underrepresented in terms of domestic violence issues. And I really feel like we are still just at the beginning of understanding how much domestic violence is occurring in Asian American and Asian communities and refugee communities. And again, all of this, I just feel so strongly the intersections with what all of the other panels have been speaking about, that these are things that happen to women who are living in under-resourced communities who feel very, very vulnerable. I completely agree that, there's so much reform work that needs to happen in our criminal justice system, and that truly the funding needs to shift away from criminal justice to really helping people to have the resources they need, but then also to really think about, not only the victims, but the victimizers, and really thinking through how they can be rehabilitated, how we can lift them up. I think ultimately going back to the work that Facing History does in the classrooms, right? We so much want to help teachers, help students to understand that all of us are really complex human beings, that none of us should be judged on the worst thing we've ever done, right? That there's so much more complexity to who we are, and that we always should have, the ability to kind of rise up from our worst moments and become the better people that each of us has the ability to be. So I hope I kind of began to get at some of your very complex question, but I also just think that all of this is so intertwined with each other. So I hope that comes out as well.
Yeah, no, I definitely think you answered the question for me, and kind of my own instinctual response to that shooting too was it just seemed so obvious to me. But I don't, as was mentioned by another panelist, some of these themes are that racism has been just so integrated into our society and culture for so long, and we were all raised with particular biases and images, and it's the same thing with misogyny and these biases we have, and then again in particular groups of women too. So again, the intersections, because over sexualization also and an assumption of maturity also happens for young women in the Black and
Absolutely.
Latina community
Yes.
as well.
Yes.
And so how that all plays a role into these violences that are happening against women, which really are spilling out into the community in a larger sense. So
Yes, and
history is so important.
I think, Tracy, again, I just want to thank you for bringing this group of women together today, because I think one of the things that I am so hopeful about is seeing how much solidarity building is happening amongst these different communities coming together and understanding that we do have very much common enemies and that we need to be all working together in solidarity to lift each other up.
Thank you. Yes.
Can I just make a comment on mass shootings that we're seeing, at least on the South and West side, that it's a little different than where there are certain folks targeted. Often what we're seeing is, and this is an issue with the NRA and guns, is that it's people with these large drum magazines or these extended clips that are coming and shooting into a crowd. They have one target often, but we see it's called a mass shooting because it's more than 4 people, right, are hit. So I just want to, I want to just make that note for folks that when you hear that Chicago is leading the country in that, part of that is the guns that are being used in Chicago. And it's, so it's not necessarily that it's the same misogyny or the same background in that. Often it is maybe an interpersonal conflict with one person that's leading to, whether that's domestic related or not, but that's leading to a lot of the mass shootings here in Chicago.
Thank you for reiterating that. If it
So
wasn't clear.
I want to push back on that a little bit, Tara, because being from the West Side, I do think that misogyny, and I also think that toxic masculinity has a lot to do with it, because women and girls, and particularly Black women and girls, I could speak, that's how I identify, we're seen as invisible in the community. So they don't care who they're hitting in that case. And so I do think that plays a role, because it's about, when we talk about toxic masculinity and misogyny, it's about taking up space. And if you are not conscious of other people who are in the space with you, and they are not as important, or their lives are not as important, and your main goal is to get that one person who you're looking for, and you don't care if you shoot down a 7-year-old girl or a group of people, that definitely has a role. And that's a conversation that has come up in the Black community a lot, because when we think about the vast rate of Black women dying by way of gun violence, it often is to this community violence and to domestic violence that is occurring.
Absolutely. And I agree with that 100%. I agree with that, Kina. I think that's absolutely fair. I just, yeah, I think that I want people to see the guns too, like that there's that connection there as well, that we're seeing so many of those high-powered guns in Chicago.
Right. But I also think it's just community. Go ahead, Celia. Sorry.
I was gonna say, a lot of Black and brown women also become targets because they can't get you, they're gonna get your girl, they're gonna get your family.
That's
and
right.
that's what's happening. And that's also tied to the toxic masculinity and all of that stuff.
Right.
And
It's
the thing
kind of
is
about
too,
ownership, right? And if they're
ownership. And what kills me with guns, right? We could send people to the moon, we could put microchips inside of people, but we can't put an invisible scanning device on every bullet that's made. I mean, everybody else is held accountable, but except for the manufacturers, except for the people that create things. You know, most Black and brown people from the West Side and the South Side can't even afford, you know, to make these and put them in our communities. So, I mean, it's a whole bigger conversation as to how these even get put in our hand. I mean, the guns that are out here, I've never even heard of some of them, right? Because they're military style guns. You know, back in I could speak for the early 90s before I went away, I was a witness to finding trays of, you know, like crates of guns in the South Chicago neighborhood, you know, behind Bowen High School, behind CVS. And they were put there purposefully for us to kill ourselves, you know? And the thing is, no one knew where they came from, but they just popped up in these communities. I'm pretty sure these things wouldn't just pop up in Naperville, you know, like it's just things that are put in place to create the violence, because the violence at the end of the day creates money. It's a money machine. And as long as this money machine continues to fuel the 1%, all these private prisons are still going to work. Slavery is still there. All of these toxic systemic harms will always be in place until we as a nation decide that we're going to start treating people as human beings and looking at people and their problems, right? Like I said earlier today, what if you were to talk to me and before you started talking to me, you actually got to see my movie, my life? You would look at me at a whole different way and talk to me in a whole different way. And that's the problem. A lot of us don't even look at each other like humans.
Sorry, I'm focusing on this one thing you said, Celia, and it's also important, but the one thing about kind of the trackable weaponry, right? And again, this is kind of that power and control, keeping it so that there can be oppression over people's very easy thing probably to do or institute a law in, but there's resistance to that. And again, comes back to white supremacy, toxic masculinity, it all kind of ties together. But actually segues into a good question for Kina too, because as working for GPEC ICHP and also many other organizations involved in gun violence prevention for all, we actually have made some progress in some of the laws in Illinois. But I'm just curious where you see this going, what things really you see are the next step level things that need to be instituted, maybe including tracking of bullets that are really going to be important moving forward, but also in a context of specifically looking at women and this, domestic family violence situation that fuels so much of the day-to-day gun violence.
Yeah, I think, I don't know who said it, but it is true that those who are closest to the pain need to be closest to the power when we're talking about public policy. I always say that I didn't choose organizing chose me. I witnessed a child in front of my home in Austin gunned down in front of me, and I could identify the shooter and the victim. That happened when I was 7 years old, right? And so that trauma lives with you for the rest of your life. And when we come into these public policy rooms, and I see Eileen had left a comment about the bio bill, how she felt that it was watered down. It's this constant concession. Listen, I believe in compromise. I believe in sitting with people, but what are we continuously compromising? When Celia was talking about structural violence, why are we compromising public education, healthcare, voting rights? We're continuously compromising ourselves in these public policy rooms. I think unity is great, but freedom is better. And in order for us to be free in our communities, our children have to feel that they can walk around, and that our and neighbors need to feel like they deserve safety. I want to hold space again for Yasmin Perez and Giovanni, the young people who were shot execution style here in Humboldt Park during the Puerto Rican Day Parade. It's the fact that you as Tara said, can get these guns, obtain these guns. It's the fact that we can't track them. One of the critiques that I've always had, and I'm glad to see traction and movement on it, is the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which is the federal legislation that protects gun manufacturers from being sued. Every other industry in this country is regulated except for guns. If you go to a bar and you get drunk, and the bartender doesn't cut you off, you grab your car keys, you stumble out the bar, you get in your car, and tragically, you kill somebody, guess what? The victim of that family can sue you, they can sue the bar, and they can sue the bartender because of negligence. And that is the same energy that we need to keep for gun shops and gun manufacturers across this country. When people say it's racist that, we're talking about putting more safeguards and guardrails in place for public safety. No, what's racist is that wealthy white male gun manufacturers and gun shop owners profited off of COVID-19. They profited off of the insurrection on January 6th. They profited off of the George Floyd uprisings that happened across this country this year. And what happened? We saw an uptick in gun violence and homicides. Cook County was the bloodiest county in all 102 counties across the state, with 900 homicides, over 760 plus of those being gun related. And so I think that that's right. Those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And when we talk about the vision and the future of public policy, Tracy, and what that means for the state of Illinois and federally, when I sat on the Biden-Harris transition team for gun violence prevention, we were talking to them about the same things that have come up in this conversation, is that we don't need the feds to parachute into our communities. We need to build bridges and invest in these community organizations so that they're not organizing in silos, and that we're building a fortress for the people in these communities. The second thing that I'll say, outside of the Protection of Commerce and Arms Act that's out, that protects these gun manufacturers is the Violence Against Women Act. We need to reauthorize it. It has not been a priority. For 3 years, it has lapsed in our federal government. This is legislation that protects against sexual assault against women and girls, protects against stalking, protects against domestic violence, and puts the actual funding in grants into the places like organizations like the one that Celia's running, like the one that Tara works at, because we should be protecting women and girls. And so the fact that we haven't made this a priority, that we can't get things passed, is an indication that we have to continue to apply the pressure and make sure that we're moving with a sense of urgency. You know, this is the final thing I'll say. As somebody who lives in an impacted community, it blows my mind that somebody can get a gun in Georgia in a private sale without getting an ID, but you can't even vote in Georgia, you know, with an ID in Georgia. And so we have states across this country, and we have to look at this as a comprehensive issue. Illinois is doing all we can to progressively move forward common sense gun safety, but it means nothing if Indiana is not catching up, if Wisconsin is not catching up, if Mississippi is not catching up to what we're doing. And so, yeah, I think those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. We have to apply the pressure to our legislators, and we have to continue to inject this gender-based lens in all of our public policy.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that absolutely, like, Illinois' work is just a safeguard, but you're absolutely right. It really, a lot of this has to come at the national level. The Violence Against Women Act being such an important piece of the puzzle as well. And, you know, putting the people in power. I think about the folks that really have been very active in the laws that have passed, not only gun violence prevention, but the criminal justice reforms have been, you know, people from the communities that have been impacted, or have been impacted in some cases themselves with trauma and violence. So getting more of those people elected and into positions where they can look rationally at these laws and how are they actually going to be applied in a way that's going to protect people, I think is the end of the game. And they will know that better than anybody else out there, which actually kind of leads into my next question, a little bit about criminal justice and police violence as well. And so I'm going to stick with you, Kina, on this. And you were quite involved in the organizing the Laquan McDonald protests against excessive police violence. And in addition, last year was just full of so much trauma for many in the Black community. First, you know, the ravages of COVID illness and deaths due to the systemic equities in our healthcare system, and then the murder of George Floyd, which fueled many of the protests that were out there here and across the country. And in all of that, Breonna Taylor had also been killed by police, and that was in mid-March before the COVID epidemic. Even though her murder did not get as much attention by the public, I do think it got the attention of some of our Illinois lawmakers. And so actually next week, July 1st, is when the new criminal justice reform laws are going to take effect. And one of them that made me think about Breonna was the limitations on the no-knock warrants, which is, for those of you who may not know about Breonna Taylor, she was basically murdered in her own bed while sleeping in her own bed because the police entered on a no-knock warrant to actually the wrong home. So Kina is an activist both in the spaces of excessive police force and gun violence prevention. You know, I would say, what do you feel we need to do as specifically more in Illinois, maybe federally too, I don't know, in the space of police reform that would help kind of protect particularly Black and Brown sisters out there from police harm, including gun violence?
Such a good question. What people don't know about the story of Laquan McDonald and the arc of that story, it started with Rekia Boyd. It started with us saying, say her name, right? And we'll talk a little bit just like about that. You can't talk about the Black Lives Matter movement without talking about Black women and the gender specific ways that policing takes place of Black women in the context of just policing in the country. And when I say gender specific, there are so many cases of sexual assault, sexual abuse that happen between police and Black and brown women. And an example of that is Daniel Holzclaw, former officer of Oklahoma, where he basically targeted low-income Black women in Oklahoma City and raped them, and was eventually caught, charged, convicted, and is now spending a lifetime in prison. And so whether we're talking about those survivors in Oklahoma City or folks like Fannie Lou Hamer, who were arrested in the Louisiana Parchment Farm and talked about the sexual abuse that happened behind prison walls with police officers and just law enforcement. We're talking about us needing to create space for when we cannot easily galvanize around victims. So a lot of this is happening in homes, the sexual assault, a lot of this is happening in prisons, behind the walls, where people cannot easily galvanize around the victims and really make the noise. And so we need to understand that the policing against Black women is also very gender specific. 80%, the Campaign for Fair Sentencing for Youth put out a statistic that in many states, 80% of young girls in particular, which we know is disproportionately Black and brown juveniles in the juvenile justice system, you can stem their history back to physical and sexual abuse. And so making sure that we are being culturally competent to what's happening, because once these young women and women in general are put into the system or have experienced that level of abuse or sexual assault, they're not getting the treatment that they need. You're basically just using these prisons as garbage bins to throw people in because you don't want to handle the problems of the systemic issues that are happening. And so when we talk about Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, Rekia Boyd, when we talk about and lift up their names, it is to say that, one, understand that the movement in itself, the Black Lives Matter movement, became young Black men being gunned down by white male police officers. But really, Black Lives Matter was about the liberation of Black people in general. That includes trans Black people. That includes the LGBTQ community, the disability rights community. That includes folks who identify as Black folks. And it got co-opted to just particularly focus on men who are shot by police officer, which created the movement of Say Her Name. But for me, we shouldn't be in a place and in a space where we have to create a proxy group for something that should be inclusive of all of us. And so when we have to create those proxy groups, then what do we know? We know that the misogyny is still embedded and infecting the movements that we're doing. Well, it's erasure, essentially, of these voices. And so our job just in this movement space is to say that we have to include women and girls in this type of policing that's happening, even if they don't get shot, because as people were saying on the panel, violence manifests itself in a multitude of ways. It's not just someone punching you or somebody gunning you down, or a police officer or a law enforcement person gunning you down. It is also sexual violence. It is also financial violence. It is also educational violence. All of those things are part of this movement. And when I wrote and advocated for the Illinois Council on Women and Girls Act, the number one issue that came up was sexual assault on college campuses or in home. That was the bridging point. So people were telling me Republican women are not gonna want to talk about reproductive health care or these issues that are important to Democratic women. And what we found was incredibly freeing, that 100% of the rooms that I held focus groups for, Tracy, and I would ask the question, if you've ever experienced sexual assault, sexual harassment, or abuse in that way, raise your hand. 100% of the rooms would raise their hand. That was the one common line. And so when we trace this back to movement work around Black Lives Matter and the policing of Black bodies, and Black women have had our bodies policed for millennia here in the United States of America. The linkage and the history between Black Lives Matter and chattel slavery in America is Black men, they had no problem murdering, but they had to keep Black women to keep producing slaves. And so when we talk about the policing of Black bodies of women or those who identify in the feminine, understand that we can't talk about Black Lives Matter without talking about the history and the manipulation of the bodies of Black women.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Again, coming back into history, I know Maureen will appreciate that connection, and also really actually opened my eyes, had not really seen or thought before about the whole transparency point of that in some of these movements, again, kind of being usurped or taken over, whether it's from male voices or other voices, to turn it into something, again, that's not as inclusive, that's not including all the voices that need to be in the room. So thank you for sharing that. And I'm a little worried about the time, but I felt like it was such an important question. I did want to talk to Celia, and it really actually kind of ties in with these numbers. The number of people who raised their hand in that room, honestly, Kina, does not surprise me one bit. That is my experience in the work that I do as well, is that pretty much every woman has been impacted in one way or another with some type of sexual violence. But for Celia, you know, you work very closely with many current and formerly incarcerated women, and I'm curious, you know, the experiences you have seen, that intersection, particularly again, how it impacts women of color as far as the criminal justice system and how they respond and maybe unjustly respond to verdicts and sentencing, but also most specifically the law that was passed in Illinois in 2016 that does allow for reduced sentencing for defendants if they have been found to be victims of abuse and have acted in self-defense, which I was very pleased when that passed. But given the statistics from some of the domestic violence networks that, in fact, the network that I work with, that showed that an estimated 77% of women currently incarcerated were victims of abuse, how have you seen this reduced sentencing actually utilized? Like, is this law actually utilized? And if it is utilized, is it fair, or is there inequities, again, depending on the color of your skin, or, you know, your gender, you know, how you identify as with your gender, or who you love?
Right. Well, you asked a lot of questions in this question, which I could have a whole hour for myself on every single thing that you touched, but I won't. What I would like to say is that prisons were meant, when they were built, for men. They didn't even know how to address women when they got started. There's never been any kind of real rehabilitation behind these walls except more trauma, especially towards women. You have to remember, back in the days, even now, the number ratio as far as officers, COs, for men is higher than women. Even the women that are COs are actually sexually harassed by other officers that are within the prison. It becomes a very toxic space where that, you know, we talked about rape. I was a witness to many rapes. Unfortunately, I am the face, and I am also a prison rape victim survivor when I was a child. And you have to remember, who are you going to report it to? The same system that's hurting you? You know, before PREA, and I did a lot of work helping Sonia Harper, State Rep Sonia Harper, bringing a resolution date to the PREA, because you got to remember, rapes in prisons have always existed, even like back in the day with slavery, right? They've always raped our women. And no one's ever had an outcry. Even with the Me Too movement, there was never an outcry for incarcerated women. When I went to the Women's March here in Illinois for the Me Too, the Women's March, I was the only woman among thousands of women holding a sign up in regards to Me Too for incarcerated women, right? Nobody else. And everybody was taking pictures of my sign. But everybody knows it happens. Even the president, I mean, before PREA came out, it sat on President Bush's desk for 10 years before he even enacted upon it. Why? Because we've always been seen as dispensable, right? Our bodies have always been seen as, you know, these bodies that can just take whatever, and that we didn't matter, right? We were invincible and we're okay to be harmed. There's just so much in that conversation, you know, a lot of women. I left prison in 2000. And when I left there, I knew a lot of women who were older women when I was there, who are doing life, who are doing many, many years from being victims of domestic violence, right? Back in the day, you used to be married and you called the police on your husband. The police would be like, well, why are you calling me? You're married, you know? Take a walk. No one would document what was happening. A lot of us are ashamed to talk about what happens behind closed doors. We're shamed by society. We're not believed. You know, how can someone come forward when you're shamed in the public eye, like by society? What did you wear? What did you say? Everything goes back to not being a victim, but you being at fault for what happened to you.
Mm-hmm.
But even now in the outside world, most people don't report sexual assaults because at the end of the day, they don't get a lot of time. The person, if they get caught, you have to be re-traumatized, yet you're treated not like a victim, but the criminal when you're testifying. And then as Black and brown women, if you have a record, you feel like no one's ever going to believe you. So why am I going to put my family and myself through all this trauma and shame and harm just to be harmed again and not believed by a system that's already set up not to believe you or not to see you as a credible victim? So there's a lot that goes into that. And I know a woman, a really good friend of mine. She's actually one of the executive directors to the Fully Free campaign, who was the first woman. Her name is Willette Benford, who was released on that new act that you speak of. And, you know, it took lots of hoops. I don't really know her whole story, but there's not that many women that have been released, even though this new legislation was put in place. Because remember, if you can't document what happened to you prior to that crime happening, and a lot of women didn't know about documentation, never, you know, reached out for help. And you also have to remember, you're fighting pieces of paper, what somebody wrote about you. It's not your narrative. It's somebody else's narrative, somebody else's bias, somebody else's thoughts that put that together. So when you're seen in a courtroom, you're not seen as a human being. You're a piece of paper, numbers with a report that somebody else wrote in their own way, in their own bias, and their own, you know, bigotry, however they did it. What if it's somebody that hated women that wrote this? So you're being judged by something that you have no say-so to. Your voice is not even put in there. And again, what led up to them circumstances are never talked about. And it's a shame because there's people that will die in prison. Women who could be out here helping, stopping the violence, will die in prison because they were not credible victims.
I think that's one of the saddest things. These are voices of women that were victimized, and at some point, you know, you have to fight back or you're not going to survive that environment. And yet then there's the penalization, the victim blaming, like you said, and this is definitely an area I'd love all of our participants to become more aware of and follow is, you know, the incarcerated women, and thinking about this combination of, yes, gun violence, because guns might have been used in their crimes, but really, what's the whole picture? What's the whole story behind this? So,
and another thing I'd like to
wait, Celia, I'm sorry, I want to hear from you. Hopefully it'll come up in a question, because I do want to, we have just a few minutes left, and I want to make sure that if there's any audience questions that we can address them, and then we'll give you a chance to fill in the last bit you want to say.
Sure. I just wanted to make one comment while you're reading a question. You have to remember that in a courtroom, women are always looked at differently than men, and we're treated unfairly and we're punished more harshly because we're mothers. Unlike society, right? If a man goes to jail and I go to jail, they're not going to ask him where his kids are at, but they're going to ask me. So remember that.
Well, and I think it might have been you that said that women are not listened to, but Black women and brown women are absolutely ignored. So there's definitely transparency and not seeing the bigger picture for women, and the voices and the roles we play in society, our importance in society. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Araceli. I just wanted to share some of the organizations that are represented here with this slide. So for those of you who want to learn more, reach out or donate. And Araceli, I'll let you take over. Thank you so much to the panelists for having these discussions with me today. I really appreciate all of you so much and for what you do.
Thank you so much, everyone. We might have time for one question. I see a comment from Jacqueline, it's hard when you are a woman, and it's harder as well when we don't speak English. So another barrier to seeking help and support. Any other questions from the audience or participants? Anything that was impactful? I have a question that I guess we can do a quick round on. How can we support the work that the panelists here are doing? How can we support the work or align some of the work that participants are doing with your efforts?
You need to fund the movement. Find an organization. I was fortunate enough, and I want to thank Tracy for even giving me the option to still come on to give my money to Good Kids Mad City. It is one of my favorite organizations here in the city of Chicago. Fund the movement. Find a group that's doing the good work. Make sure that you can either volunteer hours or write a check.
I agree with that. And I'll also say to talk to your elected officials about funding the movement, right? And talk to, particularly now as we're talking about money from the American Recovery Plan, it's important to encourage that those dollars go to groups that are directly doing the work. Historically, dollars have gone to law enforcement, which, you know, law enforcement are our partners, but we know that the work being done on the ground is really making a difference. And that's, you know, that's where we're seeing those reductions. So agreed with Kina, fund the movement and tell other people that there are good things happening on the south and west side of Chicago. We talk to your media contacts, tell them to talk about the good stories. I mean, we're opening a community plaza in West Garfield Park on Madison, right there in the area where all the people talk about disinvestment and violence, but talk to people. The mayor's office is helping with this. So I want to say, like, push for that from your elected officials and communities and media.
I'd just like to add to everything they just said. If you don't want to contact their local officials, become the next elected official. Become what we need. You know, we need people to take over these spaces that really truly work from the heart and really want to see change and really want to uplift and stop all the systemic racism that's been in place for many, many centuries, right? And not just, you know, donate to organizations like myself and all these great ones that are doing the work, but I mean, get involved in your community. You see somebody that's struggling, your neighbor's struggling, instead of calling the police on them because their kid looks dirty and they got boogers running down their nose, and they're, you know, knock on their door, see if they need help. Ask them if you could bring them a resource. Become what you need in your community for other people. That's how we do this, one person at a time, just extending a hand, an ear, a heart, whether it's, you know, a cup of sugar or whether it's a, you know, a Uber pass. I mean, everybody needs somebody, just like building a house, right? Can't do it on your own. Somebody has to hold a ladder. Everyone needs somebody. We're all connected. And if we all just took a little bit of time out of our own lives and find out what was happening within our community and how we can support the efforts that are happening in our community, we would make change.
Thank you.
I'll build on what Celia just said. So I, you know, to bring it back to the work that we do in schools, I think for Facing History, the last piece of every curricular unit we do is really helping young people to become civically engaged and to really change the way our country tends to think about civics, right? That it's not just about getting out to vote. It's about what all of you have just said. It's about actively getting engaged. It's about being in touch with your representatives or running for office yourself. For young people, it's about getting involved in organizations that are doing good in their communities. And then I think the last really important piece is, again, always just lifting up the full humanity of people. And even as we are talking about all of these awful things that our communities and so many people have endured, that we are also so much more than merely victims. And that one of the things that I think that is so problematic in our country is that oftentimes we look at these communities and see them as passive victims, and they are not. And we as a society, and certainly I know, my organization, but all of the organizations that are on this list, right? It's about lifting up the beautiful humanity and all of the wonderful things that people are doing. And, the women on this panel, I mean, that we have so much capacity to do good, and we need to stop thinking about merely being victims, but really lifting up the power that we all have, and the beauty of the work that we're doing. If we can begin to see all of that, that's, and then get engaged, like that's really how change happens.
That is
Thank
such
you
a
so much.
really brilliant summary. I know we're at the end. I just wanted to let Nortasha, who again, her daughter Marissa, this is the anniversary of her Angel Day. I just wanted her to be able to just say a few words here to everybody before we close down. Thank you so much for everybody for your participation.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you all so much for having me and being a part of this panel discussion. I think this is well needed, and this is
Uh-oh. I think we lost Nortasha, but anyway, everybody, let's carry all of our survivor friends, their families in our hearts today. As women, we really can create change, and I'm excited that we have all these amazing women, not only on this panel today, but all the people that I work with on a daily basis. Thank you for your efforts. Thank you for attending today.
Thank you so much,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Enjoy the rest of your
Thank you,
day.
ladies.
Thank you,
Have a great
everybody.
day.
Thanks, Tracy.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you soon.